this is our panel really to get into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty of what are the politics behind current land use, how can we move to a different kind of politics, and what are other ways that we can move the policy needle on land use and housing development. So I have met most of you already. I'm Jenny Schutz. I'm a fellow here at the Brookings Institution. And I'm going to introduce briefly our three panelists. So we have three experts who bring slightly different backgrounds to the table. So to my left is Katie Einstein. She is an assistant professor of political science at Boston University. She studies state and local politics and has written a book that's particularly germane to the topic. So I'm going to ask her to tell us a little bit about her new book shortly. To her left is Marian McFadden. Marian is currently a senior vice president for public policy at Enterprise Community Partners. And before that, she served at HUD in the Obama administration, had experience overseeing affordable housing and community development programs, including the CDBG program. To our far end of the panel is David Schleicher. David is a professor of law at Yale Law School. So he's going to keep us on track every time we propose things that are unconstitutional, which probably will happen.
I left my robe at home, unfortunately. So.
Excellent. David is an expert on land use and both local and state law. So to give you a little sense of the parameters of this panel, there's an enormous academic literature on the effects of land use regulation on housing supply, that land use that Senator Wiener was talking about, bans on apartments and so forth, have driven up the cost of housing and limited the supply of new housing. We are not going to rehash all of the research on the evidence of what land use does. We are going to talk instead about some policy fixes. And there are two areas in particular that I'm going to ask the panelists to respond to. One is to think about how do we change the politics of zoning or the politics of housing at the local level, since most of the decisions are still made at the local level. So what are the kinds of political coalitions and arguments that can be made to change this? And then second, what's the role of state and federal governments? If we can't get local governments to do better on the results, then are there things that state and federal government can do to incentivize changes in housing and land use policy at the local level? So that's sort of the general parameters. We're going to start off on the political side of this, and I'll ask Katie to kick things off. So the title of your new book is Neighborhood Defenders: Participatory Politics and America's Housing Crisis. So I'm wondering if you can just briefly tell us some of the main lessons that you learned. In particular, how does local democracy and the participatory process at the neighborhood level get us to a housing crisis?
Yeah, so this comes from a collaborative project with my Boston University colleagues, David Glick and Max Palmer. And what we're really interested in understanding is the political consequences of our current land use regulations. So there's been this big emphasis, basically, since the excesses of urban renewal, to sort of put planning back in the hands of neighborhoods and to empower neighborhoods to have a say over local development. And this sounds really good, right? Like this sounds sort of, when a lot of city governments like to talk about, we talk to our neighborhoods. We take into account what neighborhoods think. So it sounds really good in principle when we use this kind of neighborhood-oriented language. But what we find is that in practice, what these neighborhood-level institutions do is empower older white homeowners to dominate land use discussions and to use their power to stop and delay the construction of new housing. So neighborhoods that have a lot of these older white homeowners are able to use land use tools available to them to fight the construction of new housing. And if you live in a community where there aren't as many older white homeowners and maybe there aren't the same land use tools available to you, if you're in one of these high-cost metropolitan areas, are going to be the neighborhood that bears the brunt of these development pressures. And so we end up with these really uneven land use patterns where some communities are able to mount these really successful neighborhood defenses, while other communities receive the brunt of the development and the gentrification and the displacement that comes with it.
Great. And I'm curious if you can just tell us, so a lot of the research that you were doing was based on community meetings in Massachusetts. Massachusetts has some particular forms of local government. To what extent do your findings translate to other kinds of high-cost metro areas?
So one of the things that we did, one of the biggest empirical parts of this book, is we went and looked at all of the planning and zoning board meetings in 97 cities and towns in Massachusetts. And so we read like thousands and thousands of pages of meeting minutes to understand who these people were, why they showed up, sort of what their main objections were to proposed housing developments. And sort of one important point on generalizability, obviously Massachusetts is, distinctive in a variety of ways. The places we looked at were whiter and wealthier than the country as a whole, but the places places we studied are a huge range of communities. So there's some of the really wealthy, homogenous inner core suburbs of Boston that are facing huge housing cost pressures. But we also studied older industrial cities that are really socioeconomically diverse and farther away from the urban core of Boston. So for people who know the region, places like Lawrence, Massachusetts, and Worcester, Massachusetts, these are not places that are facing housing crises on the order of San Francisco or Los Angeles. Like, they're very different housing markets. And in every single city and town we studied, the advantage dominated these proceedings. They were consistently dominated by older white homeowners. We felt like Lawrence, Massachusetts was especially illustrative. So Lawrence, Massachusetts is 80% Latino. And over a 3-year period, of the 42 commenters who showed up to planning and zoning board meetings, only one of them had a Latino surname. So the underrepresentation of voices of color at these forums and renters at these forums was really stark. And we think that this is a process that generalizes well outside of Massachusetts, that this is something that happens in a variety of different kinds of communities. We also, as part of our research, talked to local officials in many places outside of Massachusetts. So in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, again, not a place that people typically think of when they're talking about a housing crisis, we found that this same kind of process unfolded, where older white homeowners were able to dominate these land use proceedings.
Marion, if I can turn to you, Senator Wiener talked a little bit about the rift in sort of progressive politics at the local level, that very often the debate in places like San Francisco comes down to the yes in my backyard YIMBYs who are saying we want more market rate housing, but they are often opposed by traditional advocates for affordable housing for subsidized housing, the PHIMBYs, public housing in my backyard, and that you wind up with a debate between two groups who in some senses might be allied. So I'm curious if you have a sense, are the goals of more market rate housing and more subsidized housing fundamentally incompatible? Are the groups who are arguing on these sides, do they really have different goals that can't be merged together, or are these two groups that could be making an alliance?
Well, I mean, I think you're coming right to the cutting edge of affordable housing inside politics, right? So something that's really new and different versus even maybe a decade ago is we are seeing low-income communities and communities of color coming forward and say, don't come here, don't bring resources here, it's going to be too detrimental to us over the long run. And so some of the work that we've been doing in Enterprise is helping communities understand local housing policy tools that they can use to mitigate against displacement with the infusion of new residents. And so there's always going to be a political push and pull. I mean, rare is the place like San Francisco where people may say no jobs, because generally elected officials and communities want jobs. But there have to be steps put in place far in advance of the arrival of new residents to ensure that existing residents benefit. We see that conversation coming up also around opportunity zones, which are sort of agnostic about the types of investments that have to be made as long as they're in low-income communities, and communities saying, hey, wait a minute, just bringing a lot of cash here could be really harmful.
So in particular, concern about taking some steps before, for instance, an upzoning happens before a market rate development. So it's partly about the timing of the investment and what happens before it.
Absolutely, and just to be a little more explicit, these are things like allowing inclusionary zoning, right? So that when there are new developments, some portion of new development units are set aside for existing residents and affordable to the working class, essentially.
Okay. David, you have written a fair amount about the lack of partisan competition at local elections. So some of the cities where this is playing out, Boston, New York, San Francisco, DC, the city council and the mayor are essentially all Democrats, and there is at most nominal competition among parties. I'm curious if you see the lack of partisan competition playing into the kinds of solutions, or if you think that there's a different way that local politics could better represent the different interests.
I think the absence of partisan competition is very crucially related to some of the breakdowns of land use politics in two kind of ways. The first is that heavily interested homeowners are going to be involved in land use politics no matter what. The value of one's home is your biggest investment. The Bill Fischel's home voter hypothesis suggests that these people are going to be whereas other interests, whether they're employers, renters, unions are more weakly attached to to housing politics. And as a result, without the mechanisms of party competition or party organization to harness weakly attached preferences on a policy issue, we're likely to see the most heavily invested interest groups win. And so the story about why you see the biases in who shows up to these meetings, well, they're the ones who are the ones most invested, but we don't have great mechanisms inside local politics for harnessing weakly attached preferences. The second is that we don't have great mechanisms for making deals across neighborhoods. So one of the things we imagine, or when we think about land use politics, is that we think that perhaps when we say NIMBY, not in my backyard, suggests that you might be okay if it was in someone else's backyard, or as opposed to some of the other acronyms we use, that there might be deals to be struck where everyone would accept slightly higher amounts of housing as long as everyone else was doing it. Political parties are a mechanism for making these cross-urban or even cross-intra-regional deals, and in their absence, or in the absence of party competition, so in many local elections we have no party competition because they're formally nonpartisan, and even where we do, as you know, we have only one party usually involved, that the result in kind of creating the space for land use, the pathologies of land use politics.
So I'm curious if you can elaborate a little bit more. What would be mechanisms for getting people with weaker preferences to show up? So as Katie said, the people who show up at community meetings are homeowners. They tend to be older, wealthier, whiter. How do you get the preferences of renters, or in some cases the preference of business, to speak louder in the political process?
So our traditional mechanism for making land use changes is the land use amendment, which is locally specific to a neighborhood, or potentially slightly larger than that, but the broader the change, that focusing on amendments activates nearby homeowners who become unhappy with the change, but it's usually at too small a level to activate the interests of employers or unions, because you're talking about an employer cares about housing politics because it's going to drive down the cost of housing, which will mean that a steady nominal wage will be a higher real wage, so they can pay their workers more. Or pay them less and get the same amount, right? The same idea. That any individual land use change that's made at the kind of specific, kind of geographically specific zone will not activate the kind of classic growth machine interests, so employers, unions, et cetera. Broader changes, so changes that affect policy everywhere, will in a city or state, will have the effect of it. And so, as Senator Wiener noted, his bill has attracted the interest of business and of unions that are not usually interested in individual neighborhood level zoning changes. And so, to the extent that policy can be made at a broad level and generalities, it can get these big interests. Again, with renters are kind of a complicated story. They can theoretically be organized, but getting the interests of employers and unions, who are kind of the two classic elements of a growth machine politics, to be involved. And you see this in cities and at the state level. So you see in Senator Wiener's bill has attracted this, but also New York City, with probably the only really major pro-housing, the zoning for quality and affordability, changed zoning categories everywhere in the city at once. People have already mentioned the Minneapolis rezoning, which is a citywide change rather than a neighborhood-specific change. And so that by making changes that apply to a broad swath, that you can really get at housing price changes, which will then themselves activate neighborhood big groups as opposed to neighborhood groups.
Okay, so focusing a little bit more on citywide changes instead of neighborhood-specific, where you're really going to get the immediately affected homeowners. I was listening to Senator Wiener talk through the coalition. So he said they have labor unions who are presumably interested both in sort of the welfare of their workers, Chamber of Commerce, which is interested in business being able to grow and employers being able to hire people, local trades who would be part of the construction. I think there was one more, and then sort of the housing industry groups who again want to build more stuff. So those are a number of different interesting groups who don't necessarily get involved in local politics. I'm curious from any of you, if you have a sense of, so we have the NIMBYs, the YIMBYs, the FIMBYs, and then in the case of SB 50, we have some additional groups. Are there other interested parties, people who would be affected by changing zoning, either changing the way we do it or specific kinds of change, who haven't been actively engaged in the political debate but could be, who either could be drawn in as allies or just who haven't figured out that this matters to them?
So I guess one thing we could think about is changing the way that we have these conversations around housing. So the two really important disparities that we found in our work. One is that these forums overrepresent the most privileged voices, so they're advantaged homeowners, but it also overrepresents opponents to housing. And this totally makes sense. If you think about, a 3-unit condominium building getting proposed, 3 doors down from you, you're gonna have to deal with all the construction noise, you're gonna have to deal with the parking hassles of having all those construction vehicles nearby. And in contrast, like those benefits are pretty diffuse, so you're not going to attract a lot of people who are supportive to new housing developments. I also think there's a natural human instinct when we're reviewing anything, like any kind of proposal. You see specifics laid out in front of you, you're going to oppose it. Like maybe this is me as a professor grading student papers, but you give me specifics and my instinct is to find sort of something to critique in them. And so I think we need to have a conversation about how we present ideas to communities and to neighborhoods. And so one thing I've seen urban planners do that elicits more positive feedback is to have these neighborhood visioning processes, where instead of asking people to say, here's a project, do you think this is a good idea or a bad idea for this neighborhood? You instead bring people together, and I saw one where they actually had like a 3D model of the neighborhood, and you say, hey, what would you like to see in this neighborhood? And so at the one I was at, they talked a lot about commercial establishments. They wanted like a gastropub. And so the urban planner who was there then said, hey, if you want this gastropub, you also are going to need a lot more density in this town center. You're going to need to build up to 4 stories. So right, it was about sort of the building height. And so I think, it's not necessarily a brand new group of people, but you're reframing the conversation so that a group of people who might have been predisposed to oppose a very specific proposal will instead have something different to talk about.
If you want to have a coffee shop that sells avocado toasts, then you have to have enough people in the neighborhood to use up the avocados.
Right.
I would add to that I think that engagement of the public led to the successes that we're talking about in Minneapolis, also in Seattle, is helping existing residents understand the benefits, particularly with Minneapolis connecting the dots on racial segregation and helping understand the role that the government had, and people didn't just wake up segregated, and really unpacking that. So we're looking at different cities around the country at how we can break that down. So we've been working with a group called Designing the We on a project called Undesign the Red Line, which has exhibits currently in Boston, Cleveland, Chicago, and Los Angeles, where it really goes deep on the federal government's role and state and local government's role in ensuring segregation across neighborhoods. And when people start to understand that, it helps them loosen up a little bit around, well, maybe it would be okay if the house next door was turned into a 2-family or a 3-family, because now there's a shared vision, a shared ethics around what kind of community it could be, as opposed to without that kind of a deep understanding and connecting the dots, when people go to, the schools could be overcrowded, the parking could be too much, it could just be too dense for my comfort.
I mean, the group with the most complicated relationship to housing politics in state is definitely environmental groups who have a set of cross-cutting interests. And you see this fights between local branches of the Sierra Club and the national branch of the Sierra Club, where you see groups that are mostly concerned about greenhouse gases are very, very pro-development, but people have traditionally joined local branches of environmental groups for anti-development purposes. That if you actually look at the history of anti-development groups, they actually formed frequently as environmental groups. So the anti-Hollywood Hills Development Group started as an branch of the zero population movement. So these people would go to these meetings and they'd be sending condoms to Africa to limit population and opposing development in the Hollywood Hills, and imagine this is part of one political project. And that seems crazy because it is, but it's but the environmentalism has played an extraordinarily important role in giving people opposed to housing something to say in public. Some people have suggested that what explains the big takeoff in zoning restrictions that we saw in the late 70s and early 80s. They claim 2 things. One is something about OPEC, but the other one is Earth Day. And so it's that local environmental groups were one of the things was opposing local development. So you see this big conflict and figuring out ways to activate the greenhouse gas side of environmentalism, which is as opposed to the don't cut the tree down in my neighborhood side.
And we've definitely seen that with the groups lining up in support of or opposing SB 50, that environmental groups are split, and there are active environmental groups on both sides. So I want to segue now of Marian's comment about what's the role of bringing in higher levels of government. So California is experimenting with this. Local governments have had almost total control over land use and housing decisions. The output has been not great for the state. The state is having difficulty maintaining jobs and allowing workers to retain, employees to retain workers. So the state in part has a self-interest economically in getting their region to work better and to build more housing. Marian, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about your experience at HUD. One of the signature attempts or proposals under the Obama administration was the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, which was at least in part designed to have local governments think about how zoning reinforces existing patterns of racial segregation. Can you tell us a little bit about what the goals of AFFH were and what the mechanisms were that it was trying to use to influence local land use?
Well, I think there are two ways that the federal government really interfaces with local zoning. So Senator Wiener said there's nothing biblical about zoning being a local matter. We should look at the results. Well, certainly there have been times when Congress has said, we need to have civil rights laws and other laws that overlay. And so you'll see that tension with the Fair Housing Act, for example, when communities have large lot sizes or setback requirements, or they fight against including multifamily housing in their areas. And those are areas of general applicability. So it doesn't matter whether HUD is funding that housing or not, everybody has to abide by the Fair Housing Law. The affirmatively furthering fair housing requirement is an additional requirement that recipients of federal funds face. So just for a sense of context, that's all the states and up to about 1,200 local jurisdictions nationwide. So wide applicability. HUD, however, has had limited enforcement ability, so we've only seen, really a handful of really big cases. But the Obama administration came back to those requirements to affirmatively further fair housing, looked at research about the impact on children's lives, such as Raj Chetty's research, to say we really need to shoulder in and ensure that recipients of this funding are doing what they can to deal with their own patterns of segregation, which are having such a harmful effect on people's lives. And so in part of that work, which took many years of interface with communities and public comment to figure out how to do it, there was a new rule for communities to identify their barriers to fair housing choice, and analyze their impediments. And the HUD ultimately, under the Trump administration, suspended the Obama administration rule, but there were communities that created and submitted plans that identified zoning as one of their huge barriers, thinking of like the Kansas City regional submission. Not known as a liberal hotbed, Kansas City generally. But they said if you really want us to make a dent on segregation in our city, we need to deal with, and we will deal with, some of these big zoning challenges.
So the idea was that local governments that are getting funds directly from HUD would have to identify barriers to racial integration, and if they did not make progress in addressing those, what would be the consequences?
Up to and including not getting any more funding from HUD.
So essentially making federal funding from HUD contingent on reducing barriers to fair housing, including some reform of zoning.
Right.
That's ambitious. That was a big move for HUD, I'm curious, to what extent do you think that, assuming that enforcement of that had gone ahead, how much of an impact do you think that would have, particularly in some of the places that are not building enough housing? Does HUD have leverage on the worst offenders?
HUD has leverage on the worst offenders and the coalition of the willing, right? So part of what the federal government's power is to lift up what's actually working and nudge other communities to emulate that. But yeah, the process was forcing communities to reckon with their history, to understand what had gone wrong and how it was continuing to have an impact. And there are multiple ways of looking at that across communities. But even just having that requirement there to move towards understanding what needs to happen to change history, that was a really positive step. And so no, HUD wouldn't have the enforcement ability to go after every community and say, oh, you missed something here, you missed something there. But it was driving forward community change.
Okay.
I think the assumption that higher levels of government will always do better has not historically borne out. So that if you look at in the 1970s, there's this big belief that there's something called the quiet revolution in land use, which people meant by the greater involvement of state governments involved in land use. And the interpretation people have given this is, in most cases, it created a double veto, that if the projects were approved at the local level, there'd be another level of review.
So give us a little more information. What were state governments doing that local governments weren't doing?
Environmental quality review is the big one, but there are a whole variety of other process and success meetings requirements and things that they.
And that was on top of local governments.
States,
but not superseding them.
No, not superseding them. On top of what there's an instinctive belief that having local governments, that the state has an interest in kind of solving the interlocal problems that you see in local. But it very much depends on what process they create, because state, just as a city can devolve into neighborhood control, a state can devolve into legislator control, where you get carve-outs for individual districts. As for the federal government, one of the things that's notable about the Obama-era efforts in this area is that it's a very old law they were seeking to enforce. Right? It's been around for 50 years, give or take, and there had not been much successful enforcement across on affirmative. The part of the law had been there forever, and almost since it had passed. There are real reasons to believe that the federal government will not, in the end, cut funding from jurisdictions because they want to achieve the policy ends of community development and public housing. And so the federal government generally stopping money is something that they're not so good at doing or not willing to do. And so I thought Affordable Furthering Fair Housing was a noble effort, but I don't know that it was going to be the be-all and end-all of solving land use politics problems.
At the same time, we did hear from local communities that would say, I need the cover of federal requirement to do this. So I can get my community there, but I have to blame you to make it happen.
So I
Look
think
eminently blamable. So there you go.
So I think that's an interesting question. The federal government could withhold funds, right? That's something it has the power to do. Whether it has the political will to follow through is another question. And that's a punitive kind of action. But Marion, you're suggesting that also the federal government, potentially even by having standards or guidelines, even if they're not attached to direct dollars, could also be nudging local governments in a direction that maybe they want to go. There may be some mayors and city councilors who want to move in this direction, but they're sensitive to the fact that they have to run for re-election. This could be a way of saying, well, HUD says this is good land use and this is good zoning, we should do this. We'll get better treatment from HUD. Do you have a sense from some of the local governments that you were working in, how many of them have mayors and city councilors who kind of want to do the right thing, but feel like they can't do it or they'll get voted out?
I absolutely think this is a really big issue that you worry, particularly if you're in one of these smaller suburban cities or towns, that if you support a deeply unpopular zoning effort, that you're going to get voted out. When we interviewed a lot of public officials as part of this book project, one of the things they talked about at these neighborhood meetings is people would come up to them after a meeting didn't go their way and say, I'm going to vote you out of office. I'm going to take you out of your job. And so I think having that cover absolutely helps. And one area where we can see this happening is actually in school budget override votes. And so oftentimes when we have school budget overrides, it's tied to state funding. A lot of these campaigns will say, you need to pass this budget override or you're going to lose $80 million in state funding. And so I think that could be a pretty persuasive tactic. And it also gives electoral officials the cover to, in the case of a budget override, to increase someone's property taxes for a few years.
This raises a really interesting question. So the federal government gives pots of money to local governments through some channels. CDBG is one of the big ones from the federal government. That mostly goes to bigger communities, right? So larger cities or counties, not necessarily to a bunch of the smaller suburban communities, some of whom are very exclusionary. State governments do a lot of redistributive funding through things like schools. Talk a little bit too about Massachusetts. So Governor Baker has been pushing for some structural reforms in land use. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this one feels personal. In my town, which is an inner core suburb of Massachusetts, I worked to, along with my committee, to write an accessory dwellings ordinance to try to allow in-law units to be passed by special permit. And we went before our legislative body, which in New England is a town meeting, and we got 62% of votes in support, which would, normally in a normal legislative body, you'd say, hooray, it passed. except in Massachusetts and 9 other states, to reform zoning in a city or town, you have to get a 2/3 supermajority. And so this ordinance did not pass with 62% of the legislative body voting in support. And so, Senator Reno was talking about a lot of different veto points that prevent us from pursuing progressive housing policy. And it seems like one really important veto point that we have is how easy is it to pass zoning reform at the local level? I mean, first of all, you have to convince a legislative body and an executive body to do it. But then in several states, there's actually, on top of that already challenging process of convincing your legislative body to do this, there's a supermajority requirement, which poses really big obstacles.
So this is a state level kind of structure of local government, what it takes to pass legislation at the local level. David, I'm curious if you can tell us how much variation is there across states in the amount of authority that's given to local governments, or sort of what extra hurdles they have to jump through?
I mean, there is now quite a lot. Historically, there was very little, which is actually something extremely interesting about the history of the development of land use control, that it's the most successful model act in history. That after New York City passed its zoning law in 1916, soon afterwards, the Department of Commerce, under then Secretary Hoover, proposed a model state standard zoning enabling act that was largely adopted all around the country in roughly similar form. And there's some variation. Since the 1970s, you've seen huge amounts of additional stuff added to this, particularly in our highest cost jurisdictions. So particularly in the Californias and New Yorks of the world. I don't know that they're more than that. They're just California and New York. No, it's a.
You could throw New Jersey and Massachusetts.
Throw in New Jersey
in there
and Connecticut a little bit. No, it's but so there've been things added to this over time that have made the process much more complicated. And the result of this is that we have very different land use policy across the country. So that, as you noted when you put up your broad slides, that the problems of a lack of housing production in terms of its effect on housing costs is really in several metro areas. It's not 100. In the other metro areas, there's problems of sorting and exclusion from rich kind of tax hoarding. But there's not the effect on the broader housing prices. The effect on regional housing prices is exclusively a California and Acela corridor, with a little bit in like Raleigh, a few places that are kind of on the edge. But it's really just those jurisdictions. And so there's legal process things in some, but not all of those. There are kind of other ways that land use politics has hit kind of the structure of local government differently. So traditionally, big southern and western cities had very powerful annexation power. And so one thing that you saw in those, that one of the kind of structural regularities of local land use policy is that cities that have lots of undeveloped area don't restrict anywhere quite as strictly, because the interests that own property in the undeveloped area are sufficiently powerful, whereas in Boston, or you have no idea what jurisdiction you're in. Everything was built in the 1600s, or it's been densely populated for a long time. You see a very, very strong NIMBY politics, and so the southern and western cities, because of their broad structure of land use policy, have kind of less restrictive land use outcomes.
We've talked a little bit about what HUD has tried to do, or was trying to do, to incentivize local government behavior. Is there a role for the federal government moving outside of HUD's purview? Right? One of the limitations of HUD is that it primarily funds urban areas as opposed to suburban areas, and more of its money goes to poor places, which are not necessarily the worst offenders. Is there room for, say, the Department of Transportation to engage with this? We've talked a little bit about some of the environmental impacts of the current development patterns. Could there be a role for EPA? If we were going to really think outside the box, what are the other federal levers that could be pressed to change local behavior? Any of you can tackle that.
Federal expert here.
Yeah, no, I think you make a great point about the Department of Transportation and the need to have the community level conversations about what's going on there. I would just say on the HUD point, one thing that's less noticed about HUD is that tens of billions of dollars, mostly every year, pour in for post-disaster recovery of communities. And their money does go into non-low-income communities, right? And it helps rebuild middle-class housing. The current rules allow housing up to 120% of AMI to be assisted with disaster recovery dollars. So we see in areas that have been hit by the worst disasters, huge infusions of cash, which are subject to federal policy. So that's another area where we need to be forward-thinking in terms of what's going to happen in the rebuilding to deal with whatever future disasters are going to come their way, but also how can they solve some of the existing challenges, including the need to create density around transit and the other issues that we're struggling with.
Although going back to sort of what's the federal appetite for not providing disaster recovery assistance to places that have just gone through a hurricane unless they reform their zoning?
There's a long history of the effort to use transportation money to incentivize different changes in land use patterns. That's where councils of government largely come from the federal requirement that there be discussions about integrating land use. It's proven to be pretty toothless for exactly these types of reasons, which is there's no formal regulatory. The federal government can't force anyone to change anything, and the federal government wants to achieve the policy end. And so as a result,
Well, which policy end?
the building the road.
Okay.
And so to condition it on underlying land use changes, people can differ about how effective this is. I think they can differ between not at all effective and barely at all effective. And so
it's pretty striking that part of what SB 50 is going to do is allow
You're very
taller
confident,
buildings,
yes.
if it passes, that it would allow taller buildings around BART stations, and BART was built with federal money. So in theory, it could have been a condition on building the BART stations in the first place to allow the upzoning. We wait until after 30 years of development post the BART system operating before we go back and start attaching conditions. That seems less effective than building it in up front.
Hindsight is 20/20.
There we go. Yeah. Did you have other comments on sort of?
No, I think that, yeah.
Okay.
Well, I think that in general, focus on what the federal government can do is fine. There are some things that you could imagine, small policy interventions, races to the top, that sort of thing. And certainly some things on the tax side. But this fight is going to happen in state capitals, and it's going to happen largely in kind of blue state capitals, because that's where we see the most extensive state restrictions: the San Francisco, New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, Massachusetts. And the internal progressive fights are where the action is, and the resolving, that and, it's where the action is. And so the federal government, it's interesting to talk about, we're in Washington and all, but really, if you're interested in these things, you need to be in Albany and Sacramento and other kind of depressing places. Sorry, Sacramento.
I'm curious, California gets a lot of the attention on this, and they've got a lot of activity going on. Are any of you seeing other things happening at the state level that are particularly interesting, either concrete proposals or some of these sort of political coalitions forming around this? Massachusetts
Yeah, I was
has a
going to
little
say,
bit.
it's the Massachusetts bill, which does a lot of things, but sort of the biggest, and I think most controversial part is it's trying to overturn this 2/3 supermajority, and it's trying to essentially make it so that communities that want to make these kinds of zoning changes can. And this is obviously great to sort of make it easier to reform zoning, but I think fundamentally it's still going to be limited because some of the most expensive and exclusionary places in the state aren't going to magically start coming up with 51% majorities in their legislative bodies. So even if we get rid of the supermajority requirement, there are lots of affluent places that are not going to develop. And so I think we need to be thinking more in terms of preemption or in these kinds of, you frame them as punitive, but sort of ways of structuring funding so that you have to comply with certain inclusionary policies in order to receive funding from transportation or environmental agencies.
I'd add Oregon, which is working on a statewide bill to allow increasing of housing for duplexes and triplexes in single-family zones, not just in its largest cities, but in communities with 10,000 or more residents. And I think that really speaks to the pinch that's being felt across multiple communities. We're not just talking about the highest cost cities that need to look at ways to densify.
I think there's been a really interesting division that the West Coast jurisdictions that have had this problem and have it of somewhat longer standing. California was the kind of original epicenter of this particular problem. Or you see pro-housing politics up in Washington, in Seattle, particularly in Oregon, and the East Coast jurisdictions have not. And so we see in Massachusetts is pretty pathetic. New York does not have any such politics of any sort. It's having a big fight about rent control, but nothing really about housing construction. You saw some at the city level, but not on Connecticut, nothing. And so you're seeing a really big division. And why that is kind of an interesting history, perhaps, but it's certainly the current state of affairs.
Yeah. I mean, New York is an interesting one because, of course, New York City has been really expensive even longer than California has been expensive, but it's mostly been sort of localized to the city. I'm wondering if it's, presumably, the rural communities, Albany, Rochester, are not getting in on this fight.
New York City's been rich. Where most people live in New York State is downstate, and people think New York City is a relatively pro-growth jurisdiction. It's not at all. New York City per capita builds half as much housing as San Francisco. So it is a way slower growth jurisdiction than even in San Francisco. And San Francisco isn't really the bar you'd set yourself at. But New York is its suburbs particularly are extremely slow growth. That there's more housing construction. There was a in the mid-2000s, there's a 5-year ban where there's period where there's more housing construction in Newark, New Jersey than there was in all of Nassau County. Nassau County is very big, and Newark, New Jersey is not very big. And so you see really, really big, it's a very, very slow growth jurisdiction over time, and really since the 1961 rezoning, which really radically restricted development in the city. Up until then, it had been a pretty low growth.
Okay. So I'm going to ask the panel one more question and then throw it open to you guys. You can be thinking of your questions to ask. So although I think we sort of are agreed that there's more potential for effective activity at the state level, housing is starting to get more attention in the national political cycle than it's gotten in a very long time. I'm curious if you are hearing things that sound promising from candidates, or if there are things that you would like people to be proposing as they're running for office that they haven't yet said. So it's your chance to give free advice to everybody running for president in 2020.
So I think one of the things, as I listen to national level conversations, but frankly conversations that are happening at the state and local level too, that's been frustrating about housing policy is how much it's been divorced from conversations about climate policy. So when we have conferences, right, it's either a housing conference or it's a climate conference. When we hear politicians talk about climate policy, they're not usually talking about housing policy. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Green New Deal got some early criticism because it wasn't talking as much about sort of transit-oriented development and how do we build more housing in places that are environmentally sustainable. And so I would love to see, if we're talking about sort of the 2020 election, presidential candidates sort of take those two conversations jointly and think about those issues together.
Having worked in this field for like more than 20 years, I can't get over my excitement just that it's being talked about, right? I mean, this is so different and so new. It's also really grim, of course, that the housing problem has become so big that it's bubbled up into the common vernacular. But I think at this stage in the debate, it's just the most important thing that they start to talk about it. Because there is such a crowded field among Democrats, right? It's not the time to get super specialized about your plan versus your plan versus your plan, because they need to differentiate themselves from one another. But I would say generally, we want to ensure that there are policies for production of new housing, preservation of existing housing, and tenant protections. Tenant protections are probably mostly going to fall to local decision making, but really ensuring that there are big policies for big dollar solutions, because it's felt all over the country, and it's not just the urban cores, but all across all types of communities.
My blithe answer is that instead of running for president, they should run for governor, which would be a solution to some of their problems.
Some of them are governors.
Some of them are governors, right? So yeah, maybe they should stay. Now, the second thing I'd say though, is that I think that that one thing that a national leader can do in this area is talk about the national consequences. And you've mentioned the environmental consequences, but there are really huge growth consequences. And so that there are a variety of studies that try to estimate the effect of local land use restrictions on national economic activity, and they range in size, and the variety of assumptions they make, but it's very, very big numbers, regardless. You're talking in the 2% to some of the things you see 11 or 13% estimates. Those are a little aggressive, I think. But whatever, they can talk about the ways in which that states and localities are really hamstringing national economic activity. And one thing when we talk, we put it in the frames about affordability, and that's a valuable frame in which to think about housing. But the absence of ability of people to move to where jobs are, and the absence of people to capture agglomeration economies by firms moving together because they can hire enough workers, really, really limits national economic output. And that's we're in a low growth economic era. And this is a potential tool for actually spurring real economic growth. which is exciting. And national level politicians can do something in the rhetorical space for focusing us on the big national impacts of these local policies.
And that's not necessarily just a partisan framing. This has been taken up more by Democrats, but the sort of pro-growth and pro-mobility, taking down barriers so that people can move between cities to the place that provides them the most opportunity and lets the country grow, there's no reason that that needs to be a partisan issue.
Yeah, I mean, except that, of course, it does imply, the reason you see those big effects is that it implies people leaving some jurisdictions and moving to other jurisdictions. And the reason we have some belief that they'll do that is because we see the housing price differentials, that if the housing prices in San Francisco wouldn't be so high if people didn't want to move there. And it does imply that what would happen if we reduce those things is that people wouldn't live in Nevada, right? They would just leave to go to Los Angeles because it's nicer. Sorry, I'm just insulting jurisdictions left and right. But so I think there are some real questions about the regional effects that may inhibit some of this kumbaya-ishness.
Fair enough. All right, so we're happy to take your questions. And as Richard said, identify yourself. And the closer you can get to putting this in the form of a question rather than a statement, we'd appreciate that. In the back there.
Hi, my name is Daniel Warwick. I'm an advisory neighborhood commissioner in DC, so one of the most local forms of government. We're talking a lot about state preemption of local zoning regulations. I'm wondering how the conversation changes in jurisdictions where the city is the state to a large extent. One example would be obviously Washington, D.C., also thinking Rhode Island, which is mostly the Providence MSA, even New York State, which is the primary population is in New York City. A lot of the population of New York State is in New York City, or even here in Washington, D.C., where our state elected officials are our city elected officials, and our zoning code isn't enforced by our state/city local elected officials. It's enforced by a zoning commission that's partially federal and partially local. So how do you do state preemption when there isn't always a state to preempt the zoning?
Or we could make DC a state, and then we would get around that problem.
Well, I mean, I would say one of the things that sets DC apart is its aggressive pro-housing strategies, right? So the mayor has committed to affordable housing going all the way up to 120% of area median income. And I think that because the need is so dire, folks don't necessarily feel it who are living here in DC, but we're going to see over time a lot more housing coming online.
I don't know that I agree with that, but it's okay. I mean, I think the thing is you could imagine citywide deals that take the basic structure of statewide deals, that you could imagine citywide changes. And we've seen that there's nothing conceptually that's all that distinct from the Minneapolis replanning process and a statewide process that tries to incorporate, so like the California RENA process, that gives every place some elements. The big problem in Washington, the biggest structural problem, is the sheer refusal of a large part of the city to allow any new housing of any sort in the richest areas, and that makes it like it's possible that DC has fewer solutions because there's no Albany to come in, and well, Albany wouldn't, but there's no Sacramento to come in to do something to Ward 3. But in most places that hasn't happened in those places either. So I don't know how distinct the problem is in many ways.
In some ways, when I think about what makes the political challenges in DC distinct, it's less actually the political institutions and more sort of what's been going on in terms of racial politics and the gentrification of communities of color, which I think relates to some of these points that David raised, where there are some neighborhoods in DC that have been effectively able to block development, and that has concentrated development into communities of color and created, I think, a really challenging politics when you tell people, oh, we're going to build lots of new housing. Oh, where is that going to go? And are those newcomers going to look at all like the people who used to live there? Are the people who used to live there going to be able to stay there? So that's, I think, somewhat, it's happening in a lot of other cities, but I think DC is in many respects at the forefront of those kinds of conversations about race and gentrification.
Yes, up in the front.
Thank you very much. Was a local housing advocate in Arlington County, and I would point out that in Arlington County, in addition to extensive single-family zoning restrictions, they also have an unofficial policy of non-consolidation, which means you can't bring a number of single-family homes together to then site a larger building. But my question actually is, I'm troubled by a definition of middle class that permeates all of this, which seems to rely on 2 incomes or more, when 50 years ago, housing relied on 1 income. And that isn't to say I'm not in favor of women working, which I am, but I really wonder if you factored middle class by the fact that it now takes 2 incomes to fall in a lot of those quadrants, then isn't the housing issue more national by virtue of taking that into account?
So I'll take this because I think it's referring to the presentation. So I did not look at the income per person. I was looking at household income together, in part because the choice of how many people to include in a household is driven by housing costs. So in more expensive places, people are likely to find other people to group together. So for instance, the phenomenon of a bunch of 20-somethings sharing a house and having a bunch of roommates is almost exclusively a result of high housing costs, and we see that almost entirely in very expensive places. So it's a valid point that one way of getting a bigger income is having more people work in the family, but it also affects the household formation decisions as well.
Right, but
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm talking about husband and wife. That in a lot of places, whether it's rural Wisconsin or suburban DC, you need 2 incomes to support owning a house. A husband and a wife are both working, and part of that reason is to afford housing, or at least
I think
it's possible.
this gets into some other really interesting questions. So in expensive metros, childcare outside the home is almost expensive as another mortgage. So this gets into a lot of really complicated questions about choices about labor supply and subsidies for other kinds of things, but it's an interesting question to think about. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. International Urban Alliance, unpronounceable name. I thank you for this very exciting exchange. I have a stupid question from an otherwise intelligent person, and that is what the impact of, say, doubling the property tax or heavily taxing the land be on housing affordability, urban mobility, cutting on commuting, densifying the cities, and not the least, funding schools? Thank you.
So I will cheat on that question a little as a political scientist and talk about the political consequences of that kind of decision, which will mean that you, as an elected official, probably won't have a job anymore if you make that
It's
your
bad
policy
for employment
proposal.
right now.
So it's bad for your job individually. So yeah, I mean, I think we can sort of talk about what the optimal level of taxes are, and I think the next panel is going to think a lot about property taxes and taxation in general, but politically, I suspect that's a hard sell in most places.
And I would add to that by saying, you were voted into office by your current constituents, and current constituents are always going to oppose that, particularly in communities where we see seniors who want to remain in their homes, and because livelihoods are going so long, may have their money run out during retirement. So you mentioned accessory dwelling units. One of the ways to sell those locally is to have existing homeowners who say, I want to make room for my kids who are moving back in, or I need a caretaker on the property, or I simply need the income, and it's not going to impact what the neighborhood looks like at all. I think we're seeing lots of support building for those, but if you have a community even where you can't make that sell to 2/3, you've got a pretty anti-growth
I think
mindset.
conceptually, it's probably would be pretty bad for housing construction. The greater local reliance on property taxes, this is like the basic is that gives places an incentive to try to maximize the average property value per resident, because there's the fiscalization of land use, and kind of in a classic Bruce Hamilton's result suggests that a pure reliance on property tax will create jurisdictions that want to keep housing consumption per capita exactly even across the populace. So this would be largely be restrictive. And so to the extent you're talking about local governments raising property taxes, creating a greater share of their revenue from property taxes rather than interlocal transfers or sales taxes or whatever else, it would probably result in less housing construction.
Thank you. So these are European and Asian sins
Oh,
in the American vision.
I mean, so these are, I mean, one of the things you don't see the sense of localization of property tax revenue in other places to the same degree you do here. So it results in a very different political economy.
Thank you.
I think we are going to hear more about sort of the structure of local taxes in the next panel. We may get to that.
I should have
Yeah.
saved it.
That's fine. Yes.
Hi, Ryan Bedari again, Third Way. I had a supply and demand question for housing. In a lot of the most desirable metro areas that are also very expensive, San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York City, you have a lot of either rich people in the United States who have second homes there, or more often than not, a lot of people who are oligarchs and whatever from other countries that end up laundering their money through real estate, particularly in New York City and Los Angeles and other places like that. So what, if anything, could you do about that, / how big of a problem is it?
It's not that big a problem. So it's the pied-à-terre rate has ticked up a little bit, but it's not to the point of having that huge an effect on housing prices. The foreign ownership of housing is increased quite substantially, whether it's actually foreign or it's foreign registered LLCs. But that actually has no effect on the broader, because if they're renting out the apartment, it doesn't really matter whether it's a local rich guy or a foreign rich guy who's renting out the apartment. The pied-à-terre rate has increased in some of these jurisdictions. I think in many places you've seen a very, very, very negative politics emerge from efforts to stop this. So you've seen in, say, British Columbia, a tax on foreign ownership that is, I would say, has some pretty questionable overtones to the policy. But there are some discussions about vacancy property tax, vacancy tax in order to encourage.
Which we're actually going to talk about in the next panel.
Okay, I'll leave it alone. But
We're just going to punt all of the hard questions to the next
I think
guys.
broadly that talking about foreign oligarchs is a way upper middle class people in big cities absolve themselves from the responsibility that they're the ones. I mean, we are the ones. I'm not absolving myself here either. Jacking up property values because it's our demand, and it's not like some foreign Russian dudes.
In the back? Yeah.
I gotta claps. Who knew?
Hey, thanks for being here. My name's Alex Stadak, and I'm lucky this is my second Brookings panel I've gotten to attend because I'm in town from Appalachian, Kentucky. And so I was wondering if you all, I mean, it's a future of middle class initiative, and we're talking about a big, broad topic like housing. But it feels like there's a lot of assumptions that are being made about the kind of housing questions we're focusing on. And I was wondering if you could maybe tie it in a little bit more with some of the structural economic conditions that keep like black and brown people out of housing markets with wealth, for example, that they have, and also small cities and even rural areas that have a middle class also, and where, I mean, in our area, in Appalachia, the housing market just doesn't work at all because you can't get appraisal values because nobody's building any affordable housing at all in most of these places. And it would just be great to hear if you could take I hate to be that guy, but like if you could take a few minutes for like that other 30% of the population that doesn't live in the major metro areas, that'd be awesome. Thank you.
So in part, I'm an urban economist, and so I study cities because that's what urban economists do. But it's a very good point that housing markets and real estate markets work really differently outside major metropolitan areas in a couple of ways. So the construction costs are much more complicated because you're not building at large scale. You're doing smaller projects. Lending requirements are often quite different as well. We have been focusing mostly on the problem of very high cost places where people can't afford to buy homes. But in there are large parts of the country and urban areas as well as rural areas where housing prices are actually very low, and in some sense you have the opposite problem. They're not good vehicles for wealth building because prices don't appreciate, and in some cases you can't get a loan to buy a house. So I have a colleague in Akron who says you can buy a very nice house in Akron for $30,000 or $40,000. Banks aren't interested in offering mortgages on a $30,000 or $40,000 home because there's essentially no money to be made in that. So it's a very good point. The Future of the Middle Class Initiative is not focused solely on high growth places. So this panel has been focused on that. But we're very conscious that much of the country spatially and a lot of the people in the country don't live in these high cost areas. And there are some very distinct problems that should be addressed. And it's worth reminding us that we need to spend some time on that. So thanks.
I would add, I think that the core of the problem is the same in rural America as it is in urban America, that inflation and construction costs have so vastly outpaced wages, right? So all the people who are working, if just working, whether it's one person in a family or two people in a family, just working a job were enough to afford housing, we would probably have enough goodwill to take care of elders and low-income people, disabled people who aren't able to work, and we would have our housing problem go away. But that's, the stark reality is it's very different. And to your point about appraisals, I went out to Kentucky and had a developer explain to me that it's so hard to bring in capital and get those appraisals that the first thing they do when creating a development is completely finish 2 units that the developer finances just to then have some comparables on the books. So that's something I find deeply sympathetic about the fact that there's just not been capital out there for construction.
I think one other thing that I would add too is that zoning has absolutely contributed to racial segregation, not just in the sort of high-cost metropolitan areas that have dominated this conversation, but across the country. And so again, I mentioned that we found these dynamics in places like Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is obviously not a rural area, but it is not one of these high-cost metropolitan areas that we've talked about. Zoning is absolutely used as a tool by advantaged people in these communities to stop people who don't look like them from moving in. So I think that's one important point. The second point, too, is, all of these sort of housing challenges, both in rural communities and in urban communities, have been dramatically affected by federal government cutbacks in this arena. And so when we think about the dramatic federal government retrenchment over the last 3 to 4 decades, right, this is why we're having a conversation about how we can reform zoning to build more housing. It's not that we think that this is going to be the perfect solution, and that this is not going to be, we're not going to be able to build enough affordable housing to meet everyone's needs without massive federal government reinvestment in this arena. And that's true for rural and urban areas.
Yes, on the aisle here. The woman in the jacket. Yes.
Thank you. Ricky Kramer. I'm an independent researcher and also active in redevelopment in Washington to preserve social diversity in our extremely aggressive redevelopment policy. There's been relatively, because you're talking about the need to increase the supply of housing, which I understand, and we're saturated with that discussion. I don't find a lot of discussion now on preservation tactics. So that every time for instance, in Washington, we're building, you've just cited that Washington is progressive in terms of its concern about building affordable housing. There is no way that the policies, as progressive as they may be, in our Housing Trust Fund, which has been pumped up even a little bit more this year than last, that we're going to catch up to maintaining any kind of level of affordable housing. And so with that goes racial discrimination and obviously income discrimination. And Jenny, your data that you presented in the beginning is clearly the problem is at the low end. It's not in terms of housing of absolute supply. The problem is at the low end. So I'd just like to hear all of you, and I'm sure it's also a question of the next panel in terms of tax incentives. To keep retiring affordable housing, which then ramps up the gentrification problems, just what we do about preservation in general.
So I think one just really quick point to make is that we can't get private developers to build affordable housing unless they can also build market rate housing. That's sort of, those two need to be coming together in order for those projects to be profitable. And again, if we're talking about a place where the federal government has massively disinvested from this arena, this is sort of what we're left with in an era of disinvestment, is that we need to have market rate housing along with subsidized housing. I don't know if folks want to add in.
And I would say the federal government needs to double down on its investment. So we need to see an increase in low-income housing tax credits and in HUD programs to spur the development of housing, because the middle class is fighting with the lower-income folks for the same units because the lower-income folks are paying so much to be able to find something.
Yeah. I mean, that's
a public housing policy that's allowing the public housing to deteriorate and be essentially ultimately taken off the market. That is a huge thing that we don't talk about a lot, and it seems to be, it's just enormous. And in Washington, certainly, and in many places in the United States, the IZ the level of IZ requirement is so much lower than, I'd like to hear you talk about affordability when you say that they can't afford to build housing. It's very low threshold in most places.
So we could definitely have an entire other panel on inclusionary zoning and preservation, but we're actually out of time, and we want to give everybody a chance to have a little bit of a break before we come back. So join me in thanking our panelists, and then we'll take about a 15-minute break.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.